Somewhere in ancient Jerusalem, an unnamed copyist works by lamplight, transferring sacred text onto animal skin parchment. He has no idea that centuries from now, people will hold up his careful handwriting as proof that someone, somehow, described a life in exact detail before it was ever lived. A manuscript waiting for its subject. The scribe finishes his section of the book of Isaiah, rolls the scroll, and sets it on a shelf, never suspecting what it contains. 500 years later, a man named Judas stands in a temple courtyard with 30 silver coins, burning a hole in his conscience. He hurls them onto the stone floor, and walks away. The priests can't put blood money into the treasury, so they use it to buy a burial plot for foreigners, a field that will forever be known as the field of blood. Here's the unsettling part. Every element of that scene, the exact coin count, the temple floor, the potter, the field, even its future name, was already written down 5 centuries before Judas existed. This is the puzzle at the heart of one of history's most debated claims, that a single figure, Jesus of Nazareth, matched more than 300 specific predictions, authored by over 40 different writers across roughly 1,500 years, in different languages, on different continents, with no possibility of coordinating with one another. A promise hidden in a broken garden. The story doesn't start with a prophet, it starts with a catastrophe. After the first act of rebellion in Eden, God speaks, not comfort, but a strange kind of forecast aimed at the serpent. An offspring of the woman would one day crush the source of evil, though not without being wounded in the process. Scholars call this the first gospel, the earliest hint that the story wasn't finished. It's tucked into Genesis chapter 3, long before there's a nation, a law, or a holy city, just a promise dropped into the dust of a ruined garden. That thread gets pulled tighter generations later, when God tells Abraham that all nations will be blessed through his line, and the wording matters. It says, offspring, singular, not descendants, plural. The Apostle Paul will later lean hard on that grammatical detail, arguing it points to one specific person, not a whole family tree. The thread tightens again when a dying Jacob blesses his 12 sons and singles out Judah, not the oldest, not the obvious pick, declaring that authority would remain in that bloodline until the rightful ruler arrived. A whisper from an insignificant village. Fast forward to a prophet named Micah, from a village so small it barely registers in any historical record. Yet he names, with striking precision, the exact town where this coming ruler would be born, specifying the smaller of 2 towns that shared the same name, just to remove any ambiguity. Centuries later, when foreign astrologers show up in Jerusalem, asking where to find a newborn king, the religious leaders don't hesitate. They recite Micah's line from memory. They know exactly where to look. They simply choose not to go. A king who is also a wounded servant. The prophet Isaiah takes the portrait somewhere stranger still. In one breath, he describes a child who will bear titles like Mighty God and Prince of Peace, language reserved for royalty and divinity at once. But a few chapters later, the glorious king vanishes, replaced by a figure who is despised, grief-stricken, and physically broken, pierced and crushed for the failures of others. Isaiah is writing roughly 7 centuries before crucifixion even exists as a method of execution. Yet the imagery lines up with brutal accuracy. For centuries, skeptics argued this passage must have been edited after the fact to fit the story. Then, in 1947, a shepherd boy tossed a stone into a cave near the Dead Sea and heard pottery shatter. Inside was a complete scroll of Isaiah, dated to roughly a century before Jesus was born, and the wording matched what we read today, almost exactly. The description existed before the man did. A song written 1,000 years too soon. King David adds another unsettling layer. In a psalm of raw anguish, he writes about being mocked while people say that if he really trusted God, God would rescue him. Language that, centuries later, will be thrown at a dying man on a cross almost word for word, spoken by people who have no idea they're quoting an old song. David also describes his hands and feet being pierced and strangers dividing his clothing by casting lots. Written roughly 1,000 years before execution by crucifixion, and centuries before the practice of gambling for a condemned man's garments would even make sense as a detail to include. When Roman soldiers later divide Jesus's clothes and choose to gamble for his one seamless robe rather than tear it, they're making a purely practical decision, with zero awareness that they're stepping into lines composed a millennium earlier. When a curse turns into a star. Then there's Balaam. Not a prophet of Israel at all, but a hired mystic paid to curse the Israelite camp. Every time he opens his mouth to deliver the curse, blessing comes out instead. In his final oracle, he unexpectedly announces that a star will rise out of Jacob, and a ruler out of Israel. That single stray prophecy, preserved among peoples to the east, is likely the very tradition that sends foreign astrologers chasing a star toward Bethlehem 500 years later. A man hired to curse ends up seeding the very expectation that leads strangers to a stable, the donkey, the silver, and the field. Zechariah closes the loop. He predicts a king entering the city humbly, riding not a war horse, but a young donkey. And on the Sunday before his crucifixion, Jesus deliberately arranges exactly that, riding into Jerusalem as crowds wave palm branches and shout praises, as if enacting a script written 5 centuries earlier. Then Zechariah shifts into first person, speaking as though God himself is describing being valued at the price of a common slave, 30 pieces of silver, thrown into the house of the Lord, tossed to a potter. Every detail, the amount, the location, the profession, the eventual burial field, surfaces again, centuries later, in the account of Judas's betrayal. The betrayal wasn't an unplanned tragedy the story stumbled into. It was already sitting on a shelf, written before anyone involved was born. Doing the math. A mathematician named Peter Stoner once tried to quantify how unlikely all this coincidence would be. Using just 8 of these predictions, a tiny fraction of the full list, he calculated the odds of one person, fulfilling them all by chance at roughly 1 in 100 quadrillion. To make that number tangible, he offered this image: cover the entire state of Texas, 2 feet deep in silver coins. Mark exactly 1 with a red X. Mix it in, blindfold someone, and ask them to walk anywhere in the state, and pick up that 1 coin on the first try. That's the probability for 8 prophecies. There are more than 300. One line, quietly devastating. Among all the predictions, one stands out for how unremarkable its fulfillment looks. An old psalm declares that not one of this figure's bones would be broken. On the day of the crucifixion, Roman soldiers routinely break the legs of condemned men to hasten death. But when they reach Jesus, they find he's already gone, so there's no need. It's not a dramatic moment. It's a bored soldier making a practical call, unknowingly completing a line written 1,000 years earlier. This same quiet inevitability plays out on a desert road, where an Ethiopian official is reading the suffering servant passage from Isaiah aloud in his chariot, genuinely confused about who it describes. A traveler appears beside him, explains that the passage points to Jesus, and the official is transformed on the spot. It's the same question the whole portrait has been building toward. Who is this actually describing? 3 things worth sitting with. The 17th century mathematician Blaise Pascal once marveled that across 4,000 years, one generation after another kept describing the same coming event, without any way of coordinating with each other, a pattern no human conspiracy could engineer. 3 things are worth carrying away from all this. First, the numbers aren't a coincidence. They're a documented, textually verifiable pattern, confirmed by manuscripts that predate the events they describe. Second, if this level of precision applies to the smallest historical details, a town, a price, a piece of clothing, it suggests nothing about you is too small to matter either. Third, the most haunting of these texts was buried in a desert cave, a full century before its subject was even born. Which means whatever explanation you land on, written after the fact isn't one of them. So here's the question, worth sitting with. Out of everything covered here, which single detail struck you the hardest? The coins, the unbroken bones, the donkey, or something else entirely? If this reframed the Old Testament for you in a way it hadn't clicked before, consider subscribing and leaving a comment with your answer. It genuinely shapes what gets covered next. Thank you for spending this time here. Stories like this one are better explored together, and I'm grateful you stayed until the end.